Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the G20 summit ended with little concrete results save for a partial ceasefire in Syria. But did the gathering reveal the dynamic between world leaders? UNESCO has listed Kulangsu Island and Qinghai's Li Nature Reserve as World Heritage Sites. Will the honor bestowed on Chinese sites help or hamper their preservation? That's the question. And we start from the just concluded G20 summit. The three-day gathering of the world leaders ended with a compromise on trade and deadlock on climate change that left one leader out in the cold. Although the U.S. has singled itself out, all others reached some common language in a joint communiqué and vowed to keep their promise to the Paris climate deal.
A predictable discord. US President Donald Trump decided to stay outside the group, whether in minor things, such as wearing a brooch of the US national flag instead of the official brooch of the G20 summit, or on significant issues, such as the climate deal. The final joint communiqué delivered at this year's G20 here in Hamburg, Germany, had almost everyone on board. In the area of climate change, 19 of the G20 countries reaffirmed their commitment to the irreversible Paris Climate Agreement.
One central focus was climate and energy, and here it became clear what I had said ahead of the summit. Where there is no consensus, the disaccord must be mentioned. As you know, the US have left the climate accord, or rather, they expressed the intention to do so.
In the end, they broke with tradition to add a separate paragraph to the communiqué to include the US withdrawal from the Paris climate change deal. However, Trump did reach an agreement with other leaders in the area of trade. Yet those discussions, too, were said to have been very contentious and very tense.
I'm happy that it was possible to make clear that we explicitly said markets must be kept open and that protectionism must be fought against, just like unfair trade practices. We also made clear that the advantages of international trade have not yet reached everybody.
Although multilateral discussions have not been fruitful, sideline bilateral meetings became eye-catching, including Trump's first face-to-face meeting with his Russian counterpart and Chinese President Xi Jinping's second meeting with President Trump.
I just concluded the G20 summit. A lot of drama going on there. Let's turn to our panelists for their latest analysis. Join me here in Beijing, Ye Hailin, who is the director of the National Institute of International Strategy from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome, sir. In Washington, D.C., we are joined by Ms. Basima Al-Hussein, who is a political analyst at the Truman National Security Project and a former administration appointed advisor. Welcome as well. In Brussels, we have Daniel Grohl, director of the Center for European Studies. Welcome to the three of you. I want to start with you, Ms. Al-Hussein, in Washington, D.C. How much do you think this is a failure? How much do you think this is a success for the Trump administration? According to them, it's totally a start. He was there.
Yes, well, we are used to President Trump saying that he is a success wherever he goes and with whatever he does, but as we know, that's not always the case. As a former Obama-appointed advisor, I, of course, was devastated when the Trump administration announced that they would not be abiding by the Paris Climate Accord. However, I have so much faith in the resilience of the American system, and I think a perfect example of how our system of federalism and checks and balances work is that the individual states within the United States and many cities and many mayors and governors have decided to abide by the agreement independent of the Trump administration. For example, Governor David Ige from Hawaii has signed onto the agreement.
Right. We all understand that also the New York governor was there as well, but that was quite a controversy in New York State because some have been accusing him not doing his work back at home, rather going out and traveling around. But that's another story. Let me go to you, Mr. Grohl, about that. What do you think? We talked about this earlier, before the G20 summit began. And I do want to have your reflections now, after it comes to an end. Is this going to be a dividing time in which we are going to have more realization of who is likely to be, quote, the leader or the leaders of the free world for the future?
Yes, Hamburg could very well mark the beginning of a period when the free world no longer has a clear leader. Mr. Trump will certainly declare everything he says as a success. And for his own audience at home, it's actually good if he's isolated, because he can say, I stood up for America, I was alone defending our interests. So that plays well for his audience, doesn't play well, I think, for the long-term interests of the United States, and it doesn't play well for the interests of the world. But what we have also seen in Hamburg is that there's nobody else who can really substitute the United States. Angela Merkel tried to put everybody else together, but she knows the limits of German and European power, and she said, all I could do is try to bring some other leaders together, but without the United States, it's not the same thing.
Having said that, though, Mr. Ye, here in Beijing, we see a lot of alternative choices countries are making, even during and right before the G20 summit. For example, about trade. You got Canada, the EU try to come up with a free trade agreement. Japan and the EU come up with their own as well. China and the EU, of course, long time have already got some free trade agreement going on over there. So are we seeing, at least beginning from trade and economics, that this is ever going to be much more multipolarized? And where do you think the United States is going to fit in among all of these changes?
Firstly, about the globalization process, I think we should admit there's a major problem because of the Americans' reluctant attitude towards that. All the bilateral arrangement between Canada and Europe, even between China and Europe, I think we can call them as a useful additional compartment, but it's not a decisive function. It's not a decisive part. For the world, if we want to maintain the current mainstream of the globalization and free trade, free market, I think American still is a necessary part. And
it
so,
is very important.
Yeah, and it's almost decisive. And for currently, we see is some comment said that Donald Trump was isolated by another G19. But my question is that at least it indicates that till now, Americans still hold on this current administration stance on a lot of the key issues. So it will be very difficult. I don't think Donald Trump will really care about be isolated. Actually, he will take this chance, a moment, to show how he's strong.
Of course, there's it could be, you know, in a way, being baked on both sides. You could say this way, or being portrayed when it comes to rhetoric the other way around. But let me go to you, Ms. El-Hussein, to push a little bit further on that. What are we seeing right now? Are we seeing America first, as this administration claiming, or America alone? Even though we got two administration officials wrote this well-known Wall Street Journal op-ed, and yet people are still questioning about that even after the wrapping up of the G20.
Well, I think the premise of the Trump doctrine, America First, is really a false dichotomy. I mean, President Obama was one who championed diplomacy and cooperation and used that as a mechanism to advance American interests. And so I think to assume that the two are in conflict by cooperating with other countries is somehow putting America's interests second is a false start to begin with. In terms of what came out of the G20 summit, I think we still see a lot of opaqueness when it comes to the Trump administration policy and trade. For example, there's a provision called 232, which is a national security provision that the Trump administration has invoked to study the impacts of the imports of aluminum and steel in the United States and might potentially impose some restrictions on those two imports. That is still left undecided. However, we do know that the Brazilians and the EU are in the process of potentially preparing retaliatory measures if in fact the Trump administration decides to impose restrictions on these two imports, which would be devastating, I think, for our trade relations with two former and hopefully future allies.
Ms. El-Hussein, since you talk about this possible legislation or proposal policy coming from Trump administration, it is debated also in the United States fiercely. It is realized also in Washington that countries like Canada, like Japan, like some of the European countries are going to be influenced what this possible policy when it was first raised toward China claimed. For example, the target is China. So what do you think might be the result of this, and how is this example or case study likely to reflect us about what exactly is going on in the trade policy decision making in Washington right now?
Well, I am hopeful that Trump's rhetoric continues to kind of outsize his actual policy influence. So even though I think his rhetoric towards, a trade is very abrasive, I'm not sure how much traction he's actually going to get on advancing some of his policy agenda if he were to attempt to actually go forward with that. I mean, we even see that in domestic policy. He promised that he would repeal and replace Obamacare within the first 100 days, and just as early as this morning, it sounds like that's falling apart in the Senate. And so I'm actually hopeful that his attempt to undermine our trade in that space will not be effective.
I see. Mr. Grohl, besides the leadership issue, there's also another bilateral meeting during the G20 summit that has attracted enormous attention. Of course, that is between the presidents of the United States and of Russia. Ceasefire in Syria has been announced between the two. Meanwhile, President Trump in his Twitter firstly talked about this so-called cybersecurity team regarding the elections in the U.S. Often saying, I'm not saying that's likely to happen. But anyway, he's claiming it a success. Coming from the European perspective, particularly the European Union perspective, what do you make of it?
In a sense, it's a relief, because when Trump first won the election, people thought now he's really going to make an alliance with Putin, and Europe will be squeezed between the two. And we see that is not about to happen. So in that sense, Europe can be a bit more relaxed about it. About the ceasefire in Syria, it's news to me and to many people that actually there was a fight between Russia and the US in Syria. There were some local factions who are fighting and will probably continue to fight. So I don't think that is an important development. More important is what actually the foreign minister of the United States has said, which is that sanctions will continue as long as Russia occupies part of Ukraine. And that is actually the key substance on which Europe always has insisted. And that seems to have been taken over not by Mr. Trump personally, but at least by his senior people.
I see. Yes, you do see some difference when it comes to rhetorics between Mr. Trump and his team. Let me go to you once again, Mr. Al-Hussein. Ms. Al-Hussein, about this, the election in the United States. I guess that's also what you care about a lot as a Democrat. This time, we see Trump suggested he pressed twice hard toward President Putin about exactly what Russia did. But then right after G20 revealed in the media, his son, Donald Trump Jr. was in touch with a, quote, Russian lawyer about, quote, negative information about the Hillary Clinton before the general election. So how should we make of all of these mixed messages? Where do you think the wind in Washington is blowing right now?
Well, in general, I think that the Trump administration's messaging on Russia has been an absolute disaster. It's a total mess. It seems like nobody coordinates with each other before, one person releases a statement. I mean, when I read Donald Trump Jr.'s press release, I mean, to me, it was a blatant admittance to meeting with a Kremlin-related official to collude on a way to undermine the Hillary Clinton campaign. And then the meeting concluded essentially because that wasn't actually what was happening in the meeting. And so the intent to collude is, I mean, he admitted to that in his statement, which is just shocking. And then at the same time, the White House just continues to deny that anything happened at all. But I mean, I personally think where there's this much smoke, there has to be some fire.
Well, the fire, how big is likely to be the fire, and how is that fire likely to, in a way, influence the atmosphere in Washington? Have things done, Mr. Ye?
Actually, I think I really like the word that our European friend used as relief, because the Putin and the Trump meet. It's a very long time, and it indicates how the world care about these two countries, two big giants relationship. But we should notice that the two key issues, none of them is really related to the Syria case. It's all about the Ukraine and all about the Americans' accusation for the Russians sabotage the American election. These two issues, none of them will be touched, and there are two governments' stance. It won't be changed. So I'm not so pessimistic to see that the things will be happen very soon. Actually, in my understanding, these two countries' relationship between Russia and America will maintain the downward tendency. We won't see the miracle.
Okay. Well, another thing about the G20, if we go through the list of importance, is what happened between China and the United States. The two have bilateral, even though it is not that long as they did in Mar-a-Lago, but certainly got their key messages exchanged. Coming out, Mr. Ye, President Trump was suggesting, well, he understands now that it might take longer than what he expected, to resolve the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. How does the Chinese side read these messages coming from the U.S.?
Firstly, I think that China should notice that America didn't change their policy. They still put more pressure on the DPRK to solve the problem. Secondly, I think China should also feel a little bit relief that America understand that it takes a long time. So in my understanding, that it's only some slightly change. It's not an attitude change, not policy change. It's only the voice change. So I think in the future, China and America has a lot of things need to be discussed or need to be back DPRK issue. Actually, we should admit that we have the common interest on the DPRK nuclear issue, but we still have a lot of the differences.
But Ms. Elku saying, what exactly do those words coming from President Trump would mean to you? Does it mean that, yes, better communication and understanding between China and the United States now about the Korean Peninsula issue, how to resolve it, and the time frame is likely to be resolved? Or does it mean that probably both sides have lost faith and confidence in each other about having an immediate common goal and reach it as soon as possible? What does it really mean?
Well, just from reading President Trump's tweets, I do think that he has lost some confidence in the ability to have a better relationship.
But the thing is,
China.
do you trust these tweets?
That's a very good point that you raise. Oftentimes he tweets something and then the policy ends up being completely the opposite.
That's part of his strategy, some suggest, yes.
But I am hopeful that China will, China really has a unique relationship with North Korea, and I am hopeful that Chinese leadership will take advantage of this relationship to decrease the threat, the national security threat, not only to the United States, but to all of Asia, to all of the world, really, for North Korea to have a nuclear weapon and the capabilities to deliver that weapon intercontinentally. And so we do need Chinese leadership there, and we do need Chinese help there, and I think that's an opportunity for China to really step up to the plate and demonstrate their leadership in the world.
Well, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, there has been a very clear difference. One is, quote, strategic patience, namely doing not much. The other is about pressing hard on finding a solution. Mr. Ye, what exactly it means to China, though, from now on? There has been debate now going on in Washington, if we could even look at it through the media. Washington begins to talk about, both parties, that the United States really now needs to think about the possibilities of having bilateral with North Koreans, or at least in talks in which North Koreans are participating.
Personal opinion, I think the DPRK would like to have the bilateral contact with the American, but I don't think currently American will really make the decision that launch the serious negotiation with the DPRK. Currently, Americans still hope that China will put the pressure on DPRK. Just like you mentioned that Donald Trump's policy towards the DPRK is the iron hand in the iron glove. But question is that they need China to punch DPRK, not American themselves. So in this case, I think really difficult for China to fully cooperate with American. We know we have the common interest, but doesn't mean we will follow the instrument from the United States. We have our own interest. And by the way, I would like to point out, on the Korean Peninsula, we're not only facing the threat by the DPRK's nuclear capacity, we're also facing the threat of the THAAD deployed in the South Korea. So I think China's stance will be very complicated, not that simple or the one direction.
Not that simple.
No.
Now, like what you say, and we follow, it's a very different psychology that we're talking about because we got our own interests. But this is our very fascinating story that we have been covering over the week. Before we go, I want to have one sentence from every one of you. Has this G20 changed anything? Are we going to see a turn of concepts, a turn of the world as a result of what's going on? Mr. Guo, let's begin with you.
I think we'll see less cooperation, less common governance in trade, in climate change, and that's not good for the world.
I see. Ms. Al-Hussein?
I think we will need to continue to see the increased influence and leadership of European powers and other powers in the area of climate. I think trade is still yet to kind of unravel. I don't think anything really definitive came out of the G20, ironically, at least on U.S. trade. Again, you know, we have messages, but we have to see if the policy actually backs that up.
Mr. Ye.
Honestly, we still need G20, but we won't count on that.
All right. Interesting. Ye Hailin, Basima Al-Hussein, Daniel Guo. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your insights. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. China welcomes its 51st and 52nd World Heritage Sites. Will their new status and expected tourism surge lead to over-commercialization or help fund their preservation? That's the ultimate question. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. 2 more Chinese sites have been added to the prestigious World Heritage List at the 41st session of the World Heritage Committee. Hohesili in northwest China's Qinghai province was listed as a natural site, while Kulangsu Island in southeast China's Fujian province was listed as a cultural site. China has now 52 sites inscribed on the list.
Hoshil, in the northwest of the Qinghai Tibet Plateau, was put on the World Heritage List as a natural site, encompassing a vast uninhabited area on the Qinghai Tibet Plateau. The Hoshil National Nature Reserve is home to more than 200 species of wildlife, including the endangered Tibetan antelope. However, until 8 years ago, even its average elevation of 4,600 meters above sea level did not stop poachers from entering the reserve and killing the antelope. Now, thanks to concerted anti-poaching efforts, Tibetan antelope are no longer listed as an endangered species.
Today's inscription means we have a responsibility. It brings us new standards, a new chance, and new responsibility. We will strictly follow the Convention for the Protection of Heritage of World Culture and Nature, and we will protect the local ecological environment as we would protect our own eyes and skin.
And just one day, Kulangsu was put on the World Heritage List as a cultural site. Only a 6-minute ferry ride from the city of Xiamen, a dynamic economic and cultural hub in southeast China, Kulangsu Island is about 2 square kilometers in size and is home to about 20,000 people. It's famous for its picturesque scenery and integrated culture. As a former international settlement, Kulangsu is an exceptional example of East-West cultural fusion. It features 13 consulates, churches, hospitals, schools, and police stations, built by foreign communities in the middle to the late 19th century.
The UNESCO inscription is not our ultimate goal, but a fresh new start for us to better preserve and enhance Kulangsu for future generations.
Now, China has 52 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, second only to Italy. 36 of them are designated as cultural, 12 as natural, and 4 as mixed. It contains the most compelling tourist attractions, such as the Great Wall, Mogao Caves, and the imperial palaces of the Ming and Qing dynasties in Beijing and Shenyang, all of which were among the first to be added to the list. Other nature reserves, whether on the list or not, may stay true to their mission of preserving the country's natural beauty and wildlife.
For more on China's 2 newest World Heritage Sites, joining me here in the Beijing studio, Mr. Zhu Chunquan, who's a country representative of China Office of the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Nature Resources, IUCN, that is. And also joining us here, Professor Qi Ye, who is from the School of Public Policy and Management at Tsinghua University. Welcome to the two of you, gentlemen. I want to begin with you, Mr. Zhu. Of course, you've been doing research a lot about the natural sites and also the cultural sites. Tell me, Kekeshili this time, is it a surprise?
It's not a surprise. Since the Kekeshili, Qinghai Kekeshili, it is a unique place and provide a habitat and the biological process for Tibetan antelope. This the features, the population is significant values only found in these places.
I remember more than a decade ago traveling in Kekeshili, trying to cover some of the stories related to the protection of Tibetan antelopes. At the time, the poaching of Tibetan antelopes was a great challenge for the local community because the poverty there, people want to make a few bucks, and of course the fur of the Tibetan antelope is some of the things of the best luxury, as they say, in the international market. But what about the situation now?
The situation is getting better. The population in the early 20th century is about a million. Due to the poaching for the satouche, the valuable fur of Tibetan antelope. Right. Then the trade to the Western countries, to Europe and America, and caused a lot of problem of poaching. So the population from about 1 million down to less than 50,000. So that's it's enormously.
No consumption, no poaching, as we were saying at the time, more than 10 years ago. Professor Qi, I'm sure you remember that period very well.
Of course I do. Right. Now I think things have changed a lot. Just look at the sharks, right? And also recently the ivory. China joined this international agreement, international conventions, on protecting the wildlife. So. The overall regulation as well as enforcement of this regulation has really enhanced in the last decade.
Having said that, though, even though the poaching has been banned and did come to an end because many of the local farmers have been organized to be members of the team against the poaching, they're being paid by the government and therefore they have a way of making a living. And at the same time, it's about protecting Tibetan antelopes rather than killing them. So here's the thing, what about tourism? I mean, as a result of the World Cultural Heritage Sites or natural sites, you would definitely get more eyeballs here in China and all over the world. Professor Qi, that has always been a dilemma.
That's always been a dilemma for this natural and cultural heritage site. On the one hand, you want to enhance the publicity and get the world to know the value of the sites. And by doing so, you publicize the site, then you draw a lot of attention, draw a lot of interest from the tourism. That is a dilemma, has been going on in many different places. Right. So I think the tourists do have the responsibility. What you just mentioned is a really interesting case, which is the local residents. They are all now organized or self-organized to protect the wildlife, like the Tibetan antelope. I think we also should promote a culture for the tourists to organize themselves or to organize them to actually to become a positive force for conservation, protecting the wildlife.
People are looking forward to you, Professor Qi, going there and probably do some of these organizations that tourists yourself, putting that joke aside. Mr. Zhu, what about that? I mean, do you have ways, do you have great case studies in China? Such a dramatically changing society. Commercialization in this economy is extremely high. People want to make bucks, but is there successful examples about better protection of the natural sites as a result of being listed, and beautiful balance between tourism preservation?
Yeah, IUCN globally provide the technical guideline to promote sustainable tourism. The attract tourists is one of the advantage, or is the how to
we all know that, but
manage.
The question is, do we have good examples? What is the good example, if we have some?
Yeah, for example, in Sichuan, in the Zharugou, being since later, middle 2005, 2006, to try to invite international experts to help introduce the eco-tourism concept and to design the route, and the tourists can visit this valley near the Jiuzhaigou Valley. It's called the Zharugou.
And what about that? What are some of the specific protections being done? And why tourists want to buy into some of the measures designed by these preservation teams?
First, the difference is limited of the number of visitors. It's not like the mass tourism.
That's a big debate.
Yeah.
You sell more tickets, you got more money, but you want to limit the numbers, of course, means less income. Will the local community be able to accept that?
Actually, like the ecotourism, normally they visit one side, they stay longer time. So the mass tourism only go inside and half day, 1 day, then they left. But for the ecotourism, normally they can stay a week and even longer. So they also pay a lot, not for the entrance, only for the entrance ticket, but they pay for the stay, for the hotel, and so that also can generate income for the local community.
But that sounds even more dangerous, because in Kokashili you don't have that many hotels. If you are saying they're staying longer, they are going to stay in the hotels, they're going inside this inland area of Kokashili, that probably even more pressure for the nature surroundings over there.
Yeah, that's true. So for the critical habitat, very important corridors, we have to limit it of the visitors. And for the area, some area, it's a no-go area. It's forbidden for tourism development. So normally to have zoning within the protected area is not everywhere open for tourism development.
Have you ever seen some good examples, successful examples?
Well, I see for the giant panda, for example, this is 10 years ago we were very worried, but now I think now we're coming to a point you consider to delist.
It's not endangered anymore.
That's right. So there are some examples, for the natural site for wildlife conservation, and there are some examples for the cultural side of it. And but the cultural side is probably even harder to, because of culture, it is a cultural attraction, then it would be really difficult. I think one thing I just want to mention is the zoning of the so-called major functional zones. This is a major policy of by the central government, and the central government should subsidize the areas that set aside for protection purposes. I think that's we need to consider the livelihood of the local people, and also we recognize the value of this. It's not just to be preserved by the local people. It's a responsibility of the nation.
Interesting point over there. China so far has already got quite a number of UNESCO cultural and natural sites. Look at the 5 countries with the most UNESCO World Heritage sites on our screen right now. The list shows Italy ranks the first with 53, followed by China 52, Spain 45, France 42, and Germany 41. So China certainly has been topping that list more and more. But Mr. Zhu, here's come a bigger question. You know, the reason why the local government and the community support the bidding for being included in the UNESCO cultural or the natural heritage sites is because it's likely to bring more benefits to their real lives. But then the preservation of it seemed to also reduce some of their economic income possibilities. So how should we, in a way, communicate with the local community? It's a big issue over the years, Mr. Zhu.
I think this we are seeking the win-win solutions. Since China rich natural biodiversity and also have very long history, very rich culture. So that's China hopefully in the near future will become the largest and the first place of culture and nature heritage site
well, that's
in the
one
world.
thing, but you haven't answered my question. My question is how to communicate with the local community about the importance of protection and preservation. You are doing some of the specific standards for the protection. So I'm sure you have been working with those people who have to do these kind of communication. What are some of the secrets for success?
Okay. Secrets,
real secrets for success.
Any success of conservation, how to meet the local community's need and get their support. So definitely the local community will benefit from the protection or conservation efforts. So that's we need to understand what their need, what their demand, and what their interest. So also protect the traditional culture and the way of living, the lifestyle.
Is it about development stage? I mean, if you look at Kakashiri, people talk about the difficulties of preservation because tourists want to come in and you want to see them coming from all over the world, in fact. But, you know, when it comes to Kulangsu Island in Xiamen, Fujian province, people will say, well, it's already a tourist site, right? People go there, it is something people celebrate, and it's likely to be also the venue for the BRICS summit later this year in China. So is it about stage, or is it about the educational level for people to understand about their relations with the nature and what to celebrate and what to protect?
Well, there is a wide spectrum of size. I appreciate your top 5 list, but they're so hard to compare from one side to another, right? Paris, the entire city of Paris, one site. The Kakashiri, we're talking about 45,000 square kilometers.
Right,
it's
beautiful.
Very big.
Beautiful area.
Kulangsu, very much a tourist site now. With a lot of people, very high density of population. With Kakashiri, it's on the other extreme. I think cultivate the kind of communication and also education of the local people, and also of the people who intended to come over to see the places. That kind of education is really needed. I think right now you mentioned the development stage. We have come to this stage, and this awareness is very important, and the awareness is really there now. And we need to have a better communication and make sure all the stakeholders who can understand their responsibilities for taking care of these sites.
It is important that everybody understand the message of sustainability of that place.
Exactly.
It's going to be in the interest of everyone, including themselves. Then things are going to be resolved.
Look, this very concept of shared community, of common destination, right? That's the whole point.
Big slogan over there, Professor Qi, but certainly good solutions as well. Thank you so much, Qi Ye, Zhu Chunchuan. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, in your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Xin Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight with Tian Wei team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.